Duke Sebastian Ashford had seen poverty before. From the cushioned distance of his carriage window, a blur of rags and misery he'd long ago learned to ignore. But the boy standing in the village square made him stop breathing. The child couldn't have been more than 5 years old, dressed in threadbare clothes 2 sizes too large, his small hands wrapped around a crust of bread as though it were treasure. Dirt smudged his hollow cheeks, but it was his eyes that turned Sebastian's blood to ice. Green, not the common hazel of peasant stock, but the distinctive emerald shade that every Ashford had carried for generations. The same eyes that stared back at him from his shaving mirror each morning. The boy looked up, and for one heart-stopping moment, Sebastian saw his own childhood reflected back at him. The same defiant tilt of the chin, the same sharp intelligence burning beneath hunger and exhaustion. "Mama," the boy called, turning toward a woman haggling at a market stall. Sebastian's gaze followed, and the world tilted beneath his feet. Ilara. 5 years ago, Winterbourne Manor had been draped in ice and scandal. "Thief!" Lady Constance's voice had echoed through the marble halls, her face twisted with manufactured grief as she clutched her ruby necklace. "That maid, Ilara, she's stolen from me." Sebastian remembered standing in his study, the accusation hitting him like a slap. Ilara, who'd warmed his bed for 6 forbidden months. Ilara, whose laughter had been the only genuine thing in his world of calculated alliances and cold marriages of convenience. Ilara, whom he'd promised to protect. But the evidence had been damning. The necklace discovered in her chamber. His cousin Constance's tears. The whispered warnings from his steward that the girl had been seen pawning trinkets in the village. He'd been too proud, too arrogant to question it. "You used me," he'd said, each word blade. She'd stood before him in the drawing room, her face pale as winter moonlight, one hand pressed protectively against her stomach, a gesture he'd been too blind with rage to understand. "Your Grace, please. I'm carrying. Enough lies." His voice had been glacial. "You have 1 hour to leave my estate. If you're found on Ashford land after nightfall, I'll have you arrested." The blizzard had been gathering outside, dark clouds promising a killing storm. She'd open her mouth once more, desperate. "Sebastian, please listen." But he'd already turned away. He'd heard later, through servants' gossip he pretended not to notice, that she'd been seen stumbling toward the village in the snow. No coat heavy enough for the cold. No coin for shelter. He'd told himself he didn't care. He'd told himself she deceived him, and whatever became of her was justice served. He'd spent 5 years believing that lie. The woman turned, and Sebastian's carefully constructed world shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. Ilara was thinner than he remembered, her once luminous skin weathered by hardship, her clothes the coarse wool of the working poor. But she was alive. Against all odds, against the cruelty of that winter night, she had survived. Her eyes met his across the market square, and he watched every drop of color drain from her face. Fear flickered there first, raw and instinctive, followed by something far worse. Hatred, pure, crystalline hatred that burned brighter than any passion they'd once shared. She grabbed the boy's hand with desperate urgency, pulling him behind her skirts in a gesture so protective it made Sebastian's chest constrict. "Mama, what's wrong?" The child's voice carried on the wind, innocent and confused. "Nothing, my darling. We're going home now." Her voice was steady, but Sebastian could see her hands trembling as she gathered her meager purchases. He moved before thought could stop him, his boots echoing on the cobblestones as he crossed the square. His guards followed at a discreet distance, but villagers were already stopping, staring, whispering. A duke did not approach a common woman in the market. A duke did not look as though his entire existence had just been torn asunder. Ilara. Her name felt like a prayer and a curse on his lips. She didn't run. He had to grant her that courage. Instead, she turned to face him fully, placing herself between him and the boy like a lioness guarding her cub. "Your Grace." The title dripped with venom. "Have you come to finish what you started?" The accusation hung between them, sharp as the winter wind that had nearly killed her. Sebastian's throat tightened, words failing him for the first time in his aristocratic life. He'd commanded rooms full of lords, negotiated with princes, dismissed servants with a single glance. But before this woman, this survivor, he found himself stripped of every practiced charm. I didn't know, he managed, his voice hoarse. The child, is he? Mine. The word was a blade. Only mine. You gave up any claim the night you threw me into the snow to die. The boy peered around his mother's skirts, those devastating green eyes studying Sebastian with unsettling intelligence. Mama, who is the fancy man? No one, Thomas. No one of importance. Thomas. She named him Thomas, not Sebastian, not even a family name. The rejection cut deeper than he'd thought possible. Please, Sebastian said, and he'd never begged for anything in his life. Let me speak with you. Privately. There are things you don't understand. Alara's laugh was brittle as breaking ice. Things I don't understand? I understood perfectly when you called me a thief. I understood when you refused to hear my truth. I understood when your guards escorted me past the gates as the blizzard began. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. I understood when I gave birth to your son in a stable, alone, because no one would take a disgraced maid without references or coin. Each word was a hammer blow. Sebastian felt the blood drain from his face as the full horror of what he'd done crashed over him. A stable. She'd given birth in a stable like the Christ child, but with no angels, no shepherds, only the judgment he'd condemned her to. I was deceived, Sebastian said, desperation making his voice rough. Constance, my cousin, she confessed 3 years ago. On her deathbed, consumed by guilt. The necklace, the theft, it was all her fabrication. She wanted you gone because she'd planned to marry me herself, to secure her place in the family. He watched Alara's face, searching for some softening, some crack in her armor. But her expression remained granite hard. 3 years ago, she repeated slowly, dangerously, you learned the truth 3 years ago, and yet this is the first moment you've sought me out? Sebastian's silence was damning. You didn't look for me, Alara continued, her voice trembling now with rage held barely in check. Even knowing I was innocent, knowing you destroyed an innocent woman, you didn't care enough to find me, to apologize, to make amends. I thought you were dead. The confession tore from him. I sent investigators. They found no trace of you. The innkeeper at the village said no woman matching your description had sought shelter that night. I thought, his voice broke. I thought the snow had taken you, and the guilt has eaten me alive ever since. The innkeeper was paid by your household to turn me away, Alara said flatly. Did you investigate that? No. You assumed, you judged, and you moved on with your comfortable life while I fought for every breath, every scrap of food, every coin to keep your son alive. Thomas tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mama, I'm hungry. The simple statement shattered what remained of Sebastian's composure. His son, his child, was hungry. Standing before a father who could buy him 1,000 feasts, who owned estates that produced more food than villages could consume, his son was hungry. Let me help. Sebastian reached for his purse, the instinct of aristocracy to solve problems with gold. Please, at least let me provide for the boy, for Thomas. Alara slapped his hand away with surprising force, the crack echoing across the market square. Villagers gasped. A duke, struck by a common woman. It was unthinkable. It could mean the stocks, or worse. Sebastian's guards surged forward, but he held up a hand, stopping them. He deserved this. He deserved far worse. We don't need your charity, Alara hissed. We've survived 5 years without the great Duke Ashford. We'll survive the rest of our lives the same way. Survive? Sebastian looked at her properly now, seeing what his shock had initially obscured. The hollowness of her cheeks. The way her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been softly curved. The exhaustion etched into lines around her eyes. You call this surviving? You're starving. Both of you. We're alive, she countered. That's more than you left me with. Thomas pressed closer to his mother, frightened now by the tension crackling between the adults. Sebastian forced himself to breathe, to think beyond the crushing guilt and desperate need to fix what he'd broken. I cannot undo the past, he said quietly, aware of the growing crowd. But I can offer you safety now. A house, employment, security for Thomas. Not as charity, as restitution for the injustice I dealt you. And what would the price be? Alara's eyes narrowed. My silence? My gratitude? My body, perhaps, for old time's sake? The accusation struck like a physical blow. No, nothing. I ask nothing except the chance to know my son. For the first time, something flickered across Alara's face beyond hatred and fear. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who'd carried the world on her shoulders for too long. Thomas is my son, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. You gave up that right. I know. Sebastian's throat burned. And if you tell me to leave and never return, I will honor that. But Alara, he spoke her name like a caress, like the endearment it had once been in the darkness of his chambers. He deserves better than this. Whatever you think of me, whatever I've done, he deserves a father who can give him education, opportunity, a future beyond hunger and hardship. He has a mother who loves him, Alara shot back. That's worth more than all your estates. I'm not disputing that. Sebastian glanced at Thomas, who'd begun to shiver in the cold wind. The boy's shoes were worn through, his thin jacket inadequate for the dropping temperature. But love doesn't fill empty bellies or cure fever or provide shelter when winter comes again. Alara followed his gaze to their son, and Sebastian saw the exact moment her resolve cracked. It was the look of every mother who'd ever had to choose between pride and her child's welfare. The most painful choice in the world. One night, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "We'll accept shelter for one night and a meal for Thomas. But come morning, we leave, and you'll never seek us out again." Sebastian nodded, not trusting himself to speak. One night, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was a chance, the only one he'd likely ever receive. As he signaled for his carriage, he wondered, would you forgive a man who'd committed such cruelty, who'd thrown away the woman he loved and the child he'd never known? Could one night be enough to bridge 5 years of suffering? Subscribe to find out if a duke's remorse can heal the wounds he carved into a mother's heart. The carriage ride to Ashford Manor passed in suffocating silence. Thomas sat between them, his small body rigid with confusion, his eyes darting between the mother he trusted and the stranger whose face mirrored his own. Sebastian ached to speak, to reach out, but Alara's warning glare kept him frozen in place. The boy's fingers traced the velvet seats with wonder, lingering on the golden fixtures, the crystal lamp that swayed with the carriage's movement. Sebastian watched his son discover luxury for the first time, luxuries that should have been his birthright, and the guilt threatened to choke him. When they arrived, the staff's reaction was immediate and telling. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who'd served the Ashfords for 30 years, went pale as snow. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes darting between Alara and the Duke with dawning horror. "Prepare the rose sweet," Sebastian commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "And have cook send up a full supper immediately. The boy is hungry." "Your Grace, sigh." Mrs. Pemberton's voice cracked. "Miss Alara, I'm so deeply sorry. What we did, what I allowed. Not now." Sebastian cut her off, though not unkindly. The reckoning would come, but not in front of Thomas. The rose sweet. Now, as they climbed the grand staircase, the same stairs Alara had once scrubbed on her hands and knees, Sebastian saw her spine stiffen with each step. This house held nothing but nightmares for her. Yet she pressed forward, her son's hand clasped tightly in hers, choosing his comfort over her own trauma. That strength humbled him more than any words could. The rose sweet had been prepared for royalty once, decades ago. Now Thomas stood in its center, spinning slowly, his mouth open in speechless wonder at the painted ceiling, the enormous canopied bed, the fire already crackling in the marble hearth. "Mama," he breathed. Are we in heaven? Alara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. No, my darling. Just visiting somewhere very grand for one night. The supper arrived on silver platters, roasted pheasant, buttered vegetables, fresh bread still steaming, berry tarts glazed with sugar. Thomas's eyes went wide as the full moon. He looked to his mother for permission, and at her nod, fell upon the food with the desperation of the truly hungry. Sebastian watched from the doorway. His own appetite vanished. Each ravenous bite his son took was another indictment, another piece of evidence of the suffering he'd caused. He has your appetite, Alara said quietly, not looking at Sebastian, and your stubbornness. When he wants something, he doesn't stop until he gets it. And your courage, Sebastian replied. Your resilience. He survived because you fought for him. I had no choice. When you have a child, you do whatever it takes. She finally met his eyes, and the raw emotion there nearly undid him. Even when you're bleeding in a stable, even when you have no coin and no future, you fight. Because they depend on you. Tell me, Sebastian said, moving into the room but keeping his distance. Tell me everything. I need to understand what I did to you. Alara was silent for a long moment, watching Thomas eat. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, the tone of someone recounting facts too painful for feeling, she began. The innkeeper turned me away because your steward had paid him 50 pounds, a fortune to a man like that, to ensure I found no shelter within 20 miles. I walked through the blizzard until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. I thought I would die. Part of me wanted to. Sebastian's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, letting her speak. A farmer found me collapsed in his field at dawn. His wife took pity, let me stay in their stable until the baby came. I worked for them, mucking stalls, feeding animals, anything I could manage while carrying your child. They were kind, but they were poor. There was barely enough food for their own family. She paused, her jaw tightening. Thomas was born on the coldest night of February. No midwife, just the farmer's wife who'd birthed her own children and knew enough to keep us both alive. I held him in that stable, wrapped in horse blankets, and I promised him I would give him better, that I would fight every day to give him the life he deserved. And you did, Sebastian whispered, his voice breaking. You kept that promise. I took work where I could find it. Sewing, washing, cleaning. I moved from village to village, never staying long, always afraid someone would recognize me and word would reach you. Afraid you'd come to take him from me, or finish what you started. She finally looked at him, her eyes dry but devastating. For 5 years, I've lived in fear of you. And now here we are, in the house where it all ended. Thomas had finished eating and crawled into his mother's lap, his small body heavy with exhaustion and a full belly. He was asleep within moments, his face peaceful in a way that spoke of rare, precious security. I don't expect forgiveness, Sebastian said carefully. But I'm begging you, let me provide for him. For both of you. I'll deed you a property, establish a trust, ensure you never know hunger or fear again. And what do you get in return? Alara's voice was sharp with suspicion even as she stroked Thomas's hair. The satisfaction of a cleared conscience. The chance to play father when convenient. The chance to be better than the man who destroyed you, Sebastian said, and the rawness in his voice was utterly genuine. I was arrogant, Alara. I was cruel. I believed the worst of you because it was easier than admitting I'd fallen in love with a maid, easier than fighting my family's expectations. I took the coward's path, and you paid the price. He moved closer, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. I spent 3 years after Constance's confession drinking myself into oblivion every night, haunted by what I'd done. I've endowed orphanages in your name, established funds for unwed mothers, tried to atone for a sin I thought had ended in your death. But none of it mattered because you were gone. Pretty words, Alara said, but there was less venom now, more exhaustion. You always had pretty words. Then let me show you through action. Sebastian's hand hovered near hers, not touching, not presuming. Stay, not just one night. Stay until you're strong again, until Thomas is healthy, until you've had time to rest and plan your future without desperation driving every decision. And if I refuse, then I'll honor my word. You'll leave tomorrow, and I'll never seek you out again. But his voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'll have my solicitor ensure funds are delivered to you anonymously. I cannot unknow my son. I cannot stop caring whether he lives or dies, whether he thrives or merely survives. You can hate me for eternity, Elara, but I will move heaven and earth to keep you both safe, even from a distance. The morning arrived with pale winter sunlight streaming through the rose-sweet windows. Sebastian hadn't slept, pacing the halls outside the room, tortured by possibilities. Would they be gone when he knocked? Would Elara vanish again, this time knowing how to hide from him? Well, he finally gathered courage to approach the door. It opened before he could knock. Elara stood there, Thomas beside her, both dressed in the clean clothes Mrs. Pemberton had provided overnight. The housekeeper had wept while delivering them, her guilt a living thing. We're not leaving, Elara said without preamble. Not yet. Hope flared in Sebastian's chest, bright and terrifying. No, Thomas deserves to know his father, even if that father is a fool who nearly destroyed everything. She stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. But understand this, Sebastian Ashford. You don't get us back simply because you want us. You earn us. Every day, every moment. You prove you're worthy of being his father. I will, Sebastian promised, and he'd never meant anything more in his life. Whatever it takes. Thomas looked up at him with those heartbreaking green eyes. Are you really my papa? Sebastian's knees nearly buckled. He knelt so they were eye to eye, his hand trembling as he reached out. Thomas didn't flinch away. Instead, the boy placed his small hand in Sebastian's large one. The gesture, so trusting, it shattered what remained of the Duke's carefully constructed walls. I am, Sebastian said, his voice thick with tears he no longer tried to hide. And I'm so very sorry I wasn't there before. But I'm here now, if you'll have me. Thomas studied him with a child's perfect honesty. Then, devastating in its simplicity, Mama says everyone makes mistakes. She says what matters is what we do after. Out of the mouths of children came the wisest truth. Sebastian looked at Elara, saw the tears streaming down her face, and understood that this was his chance, his only chance, at redemption. Your mother is right, he said, and I'm going to spend every day proving she was right to give me this chance. 3 months later, the village spoke in hushed, wondering tones of the Duke who'd claimed his natural son, who'd married the boy's mother in a ceremony that shocked the aristocracy. They whispered of the former, Maid who now wore Duchess's silks, who walked the manor halls with her head held high. But in the Rose Suite, now the family wing, none of that mattered. What mattered was the boy laughing as his father chased him through the gardens. What mattered was the woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, finding peace in the arms of the man who'd learned that love meant more than pride. What mattered was that the snow had tried to take her, but she'd fought back. And in fighting back, she'd saved them all.